bog, it's an extension of where I am, an extension of who I am in lots of regards.
Burning turf. It's interesting how much it's kind of woven through what we do. The burning of it, it's the making of it, it's the transport of it. It's kind of part of our culture, really.
Bogs are very beautiful places. They're places of energy, places of biodiversity, part of our identity, part of our economy, part of the rural. So it's important that we celebrate that, it's important that we conserve it, it's important that we remember it. But we're also cognizant of our abilities to adapt.
What is home? How do we identify with the earth and the natural plants and the scents that are so deeply connected to human memory and that sense of home?
There is definitely something utterly unique about the bog. And it is the fact that every time you step on the bog, it releases its smell. There's a mustiness, a smokiness, a homeliness to it that is really inviting. It's almost the smell of the memory of decay, the fossilized decay of forests and lake beds that were long ago swallowed into a lake and all the water is gone. And all the rotting has stopped. The encoded almost smell of all the life, all the creativity, all the flourishing of the leaves, of the reeds, of the grasses that had taken over that patch of land before the water or the rains had come and dampened it to an extent that the plants were swallowed up in the moisture and began to rot. It's just that slow ease of being, of life, into compost, into soil, into earth. It changes utterly then. Most people in Ireland know it because it's burnt in fire. So we know that smell of the bog being burnt, which is incredibly sweet. Anyone in Ireland immediately gets a sense of homeliness, a sense of warmth, a sense of comfort.
Lived in a small farm on the west of Ireland, in the border of Mayo and Sligo. I'm an only child of, we lived with my mum and dad, and we worked the land together. So the seasons were marked by milking cows and saving hay and going to the bog. And the bog is at the bottom of our land, so it's an extension of where I am and an extension of who I am in lots of regards. The bog is part of the land that we farmed, but it was also part of how we warmed ourselves in the winter. So we had both a stove and an open fire that was always on the go. It can be wet and cold, and so having a good warm fire in a warm house to come home to is very important. We spent every summer in the bog, and some of them were dry summers and some of them were marked by very wet summers. But the turf always had to be saved. It was a nice experience growing up. It was just part of life rather than anything in particular. Myself and Mum and Dad, we'd get onto the tractor, the transport box at the back of the tractor, and we'd bring up the supplies for the day. So you went up to the bog for the day to turn the turf first and then foot it and then bring it home. And you'd bring up the supplies, and the supplies were tea, and tea didn't come in flasks in those days, they came in bottles. You'd make the tea and put the milk in it, and then you'd wrap it in a tea towel, and there'd be egg sandwiches, or on a rare occasion ham sandwiches, and up you'd go. And so the first process in the turf is you have to turn it. If it's a particularly dry year, you don't have to, you could go straight into footing, but that's only on rare occasions. Mostly you have to turn them. And it's back-breaking work and leg-breaking work. So we'd take rows each, and then it was like a little competition of who got to the row first. And then of course, when I was younger, I always got bored and I'd go wandering off into the bog. But you had to be careful in the bog, because the bog was potentially a very dangerous place also. There was lots of bog holes, and lots of bog holes that you could see, and there was water in those, and they could be quite deep, and there was always tales of people who slipped in and got into trouble in them. But there was also the other bog holes, which were the ones covered over by the heather. And they were more dangerous because you may not see them. And if you slipped into them, and you can go for miles in the bog without meeting anybody, although you could, if it was a good day, you could end up seeing neighbours coming around turning their plot of bog. There were always dangers associated with the bog, but it was always a great fun place to be. I really enjoyed it, and I really hated it in the same breath. On dry summers, you bring the tractor and the trailer in and you throw the turf into it and you bring it home. But on wet summers, I remember having to carry the sods of turf out onto the road so that you could get it on, dry it out further before you could bring it home. And then sometimes bagging the turf, put it into bags, plastic bags. Bringing home the turf too was a big day. You normally got some 2 or 3 neighbours would come together and they'd help you and you'd help them in return, especially for the bringing it home. The turning of the turf you normally did in your own, everybody did their own turf. But then for the bringing it home, you came together as a community. And then in later years, I lived around home for almost all my life, bar where I went to college in Galway, and I came back and I lived for a few years in Sligo. But when I had my own kids, myself and Steve built a house just over the road from our home house, and we brought in geothermal energy into our house. So we heat our house with underfloor heating by geothermal, and in later years we've got solar panels and all. So we don't really need an open fire at all. We have one and we do sometimes use it, but it's more for effect in the winter. It's kind of a warming effect, the fire. But we don't use as much of the turf anymore. Well, my mum, when she died in 2022, she wanted the fire all of the time. And you go in, and it was like being in the Bahamas or something. You'd nearly need to have your swimsuit with you because it was so hot. She loved that really hot, warm room. But when my kids were growing up, then they were still, I used to bring them to the bog, and it was very important to me that they experienced that life of turning turf and footing turf and bringing home the turf, although it wasn't at the same scale as it was when I was young. When I was young, we relied solely on turf to heat the house, but in later years, coal and other things started to come in. So when my kids came along, there wasn't the same demands on the communities having been solely reliant on turf anymore. But it was important for me that they understand their heritage and where they came from and the importance of the bog. It's funny enough, in the lockdown during COVID, the bog brought in renewed importance for me, really, because it became a place where I could walk. I could go up the bog and I never meet anyone. You were up there and it was freedom. It was away from all of the things that was going on, and you didn't know what was going to happen, and you were in a familiar environment that in lots of ways didn't change from when my parents or my grandparents would have been saving turf on the bog, or when they were walking the bog. And it's quite a nice realization that in some ways some things don't change so much over time.
Discussing our kind of an environment, our culture, around the concept of a sense of smell is really interesting. Burning turf, you can smell it as you're like driving up the road, you can smell the smoke out of the chimney, the fire's on, when you come in it's going to be nice and warm. I think every family in Ireland would have had a turf fire, like it was our main fuel source. It's I think probably only now that you're seeing a generation growing up without a turf fire.
To me, the smell of turf reminds me of family. So generations back, my great-great-grandfather was a stowaway on a ship to New York. And so I believe that some of the scents that I identify with now are kind of a cultural or a family memory, in the way that magnolia triggers things from the Mississippi for my mother. But peat for me, when I arrived in Ireland, when I smelled it in the fireplaces, smelt like home, even though we burned wood in New York when I was growing up.
The bogs, immediately you think water, so they're a wetland habitat. And the sphagnum mosses that you find in bogs, they can hold 20 times their own weight in water. So when we get these heavy rainfalls in our uplands, the bogs have a role there in slowing down the water flow through the habitats, through the ecosystem, down into our streams, our rivers and our lakes, and how quickly then it flows out towards the sea.
There's many different small little tiny rivulets or streams up in the mountains, and these are draining the bogs, I guess. And as you get that rain coming down, it comes down in droves, of course. The sphagnum moss, for instance, that you find on the bogs, that swells up. So it acts as a giant sponge. And that's remarkable, because that then in turn means that we don't get the volume of the water down into the lower parts of the system as if the bogs weren't there. So they're extremely important as a mop-up operation for all of that volume of rain, and we get a lot of rain here.
They're obviously helping to clean the water as well. And with the climate projections suggesting that we're going to have heavier rainfall, more intense rain events, the capacity of these habitats to hold on to that water and slow its flow through our landscape, reducing the impact it will have or the negative impact it will have downstream, they're just invaluable.
Bogs are very beautiful places. They're places of energy, places of biodiversity, places of beauty, and places that are really important in the culture and the identity of people in Kerry, right throughout the West, the Midlands. Our bogs are in the uplands, in the Midlands, they're in the lowlands, and they're very much intertwined with the local economy. And if you look at the farming economy, the rural economy in the past, when people were more self-sufficient than they are now, we had less food miles, less travel, less greenhouse gas emissions, and we had a local fuel source. So it's important that we celebrate that, it's important that we conserve it, it's important that we remember it. But we're also cognizant of our abilities to adapt, our ability to, I suppose, take into account the knowledge that we're getting from science, take into account the tacit, the local knowledge, and to complement that with the scientific knowledge that we're now getting from the various researchers who have pointed out that greenhouse gas emissions do emanate from turf as well as from other sources.
I know one of the biggest contributions of peat is that it sequesters so much carbon. It's not that it's drawing it in, it's that it's holding it already. And so if we're degrading our peatlands, we're increasing the amount of CO2 that it's going to emit.
So turf is a contested scent here now. There's the new emerging knowledge of the need for scientific ecological action in the face of climate change. There's also the huge demographic shifts in the population, especially after the Ukraine war broke out, but even before that, Ireland is still such a welcoming country to refugees for all kinds of reasons and purposes. There are the government initiatives to cease the burning of peat. There are the bioeconomy issues to be dealt with. And there's the deeply held sense of identity of some local people here, and certainly people from the bogs further north and toward the center of the country, that scent and the peat itself is part of their identity. Their right and the right to the use of land in this country is very deeply held. It is a core element of people's sense of who they are and what their rights are in a post-colonial society, still engaging in the tail end of the troubles and peat, and now the banning of peat, burning or use or sale, depending where you are. It goes to the core of identity, because though it might seem small, it's connected to the well-being of the planet, the sense of who belongs in this community and who doesn't, and who has the right to use the land that they and their generations of family owned or farmed on.
The largest challenge, I suppose, is that we have had a tradition here of using sledgehammers to crack nuts. And what I mean by that is that we're a very centralized state. It's Napoleonic in terms of the way decision making operates. And too often decisions are made in Dublin and then rolled out across the country as if everywhere were the same. We're not respecting local identity, not respecting local geography, local lifestyles, local knowledge, and so on. So I would be fearful that a plan would be devised in Kildare Street or in Merrion Street or wherever, and then people would be expected in South Kerry to apply that. Whereas if we had a more decentralised form of government, as they have in many European countries, people could sit down at a local level and devise solutions that are appropriate. Because here, as I said, we have the upland bogs in the Midlands, it's a different thing. And then I'm also concerned that, while, yes, we know that the burning of peat contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest exploiter of the boglands wasn't the farmer or the upland communities or families who use it for their own fuel source, that local economy. It was actually the state. It was Bord na Móna, a state company that was established during the emergency. But that exploitation was excessive into the 1960s, 70s, indeed even in the 1980s. So that carbon sink has been lost. Now that we know the value of that carbon sink, and maybe they did back then or maybe they didn't, it's not for me to judge, it's smaller farmers and upland communities that are now expected to make a bigger adjustment to compensate for something that they didn't do between the 1950s and 1980s.
So if we lose our peatlands, we're going to lose a whole suite of species along with them that can't survive in any other habitat. So that's an impact as well, in that you're losing the kind of the culture of these landscapes, that it will change. I think from the perspective of farmers, like, there could be concerns they were around, like, what do you have if it's not peat? What does that look like? How do they manage it? Like, they have really practical concerns around going forward. They're already operating in an area which is considered high nature value, which essentially equals low productivity in terms of its agricultural output. So there's a very fine line of economy that they're working with between the amount of effort it takes to raise animals and make a profit on land like this, and often maybe just break even, maybe not make a profit at all. There's very tight margins in the work that they do.
At the moment, people are still cutting and still burning, and it's very easy for, say, a city person or a politician to be pointing the finger. But meanwhile, corporates and fossil fuel companies are probably more responsible than a family in Southwest Kerry. And I think a lot of people who do have rights and do burn turf, it's not just because they like the smell. It's an economic necessity. And to be blaming them when they can clearly see that, legislation or regulation is kind of somewhat stacked against them and in the favour of the corporates, I think it's not a solid argument.
The answer is not just in the outcome, but in the way we come to that answer. So the process is important. We need to use more carrot than stick. We need to talk to people. We need to explain the science. We need to have conversations. And in my research, as a human geographer, as a social scientist, I see the value of bringing people with you on a particular journey. So I suppose in terms of the way forward, it's about that partnership, it's about collaboration, it's about the state, the private sector, the communities, the landowners working together. So if farmers are not allowed to sell turf, well then they need to be compensated for the loss of income.
There's a lot of the small farmers, and there's different schemes. The acre scheme at the moment, they're encouraging rewilding of areas, particularly bogland areas, and so there's an encouragement to rewild, to let it go back to a more natural state. So that will be one of the ways. And then the conservation, as in the ecological talks, and those engagements are also a way of educating the community about the importance of the bog and the role of the bog within not just our society, but in globally they form a really important part of carbon capture.
Yeah, there is a lot of examples of groups kind of identifying local issues, and then the group kind of forming around this and then pushing forward towards some action or solution.
You know, I think we're really looking at some very deep transformative change is needed on a psychological and emotional level. There needs to be an alternative for people, and if there is an alternative that they can see is more equitable and more beneficial, I think the transition would be much smoother.
At the moment, sort of government, agricultural departments, sort of advice is to leave bog as is. That it already has carbon dioxide sequestered into it, and if you go digging it or planting stuff in it, you're releasing carbon dioxide. But I'm sort of meeting with other people locally out in Drummond, and there is a possibility of another alternative, which would be planting things like blueberry, aroma berry, that grow very well in the bog, but they would fit into the natural balance of the soil. Hopefully the land will have a healing on itself, and hopefully it'll have a healing on the people that come to visit.
What is increasingly missing is a unifying olfactory icon of heritage. Is there a plant that could fill this void? One that could serve as the next most significant symbol for the Irish people?
We're spoiled for choice. Let's stay on the bog, and let's stay with the heather. I like heather because, you know, you have heather that flowers in the spring and you have heather that flowers in the winter. And it's just the colour. Purple and white heather flower at the same time as the gorse. You have those three colours on the side of the mountain. Sorry, there's no artist can compete.
One of my own personal experiences is from the farm at home, and the smell of gorse smells like coconuts. And it's always something that I notice wherever I go. It's always gorse, and if I smell coconuts, I think of the gorse at home, no matter where in the world I am. It's quite an interesting link that constantly brings your mind back to somewhere.
The gorse, you know, I know there's two different types, but I think, you know, the European one has the coconut scent, but the Irish one has a very green, very fresh scent to it, so I suppose, and everybody would definitely be familiar with gorse. Love meadowsweet, definitely one of my favourites of the summer. It conjures up sunshine, long summer days, and you can make lovely lemonades, and you can make cocktails out of the syrups and things like that. You can make a beautiful syrup from the meadowsweet that you can then go on and use in desserts or drinks or whatever you fancy.
Nothing is as intense as the bog myrtle when you're walking along the bog. Otherwise, I have smelt the juniper on a semi-dry bog, or when the heather is in flower.
I suppose it's things like the bluebells in the woodland. You know, every May you know summer's coming because the bluebells are erupting out of the earth all over the place.
Bluebells, I do love the scent of a wild bluebell, you know, in springtime.
Here they call brambles, which is wild blackberries. They have a very strong scent, which is gorgeous, and it also feels to me to have a healing property like rose hips, a very similar kind of quality. And personally, it reminds me of New York, where everywhere there are wild brambles, and people chop them down and find them a nuisance and treat them like weeds, even though they're brimming with berries in a good season. Just the amount that we can pick in our own back garden, and along the road up to our son's school, we can make, 100 pots of jam, just in what we pick as we're walking by.
Honeysuckle, definitely. A big one for me personally as well would be the wild rose in the hedgerows, the bramble rose. That is gorgeous. That is a beautiful, beautiful scent. Violet, if you can find a real native Irish violet, that's a gorgeous scent as well. So, we're very blessed. We have lots of them. The crabapple is a little treasure of nature. It comes from these wonderful ancient old trees, with these gnarly trees, that look like they've been around for a long, long time. They produce these wonderful tiny little crab apples that people ignore generally. I remember my first memory of crab apples was nicking them from the orchards around my grandmother's lanes, playing with the other kids, and it was, like a game of dares to go in and see if we could nick apples here and there. But we got some crab apples one time, and of course we were delighted because we were looking forward to trying them. And sure, one bite, and I'll never forget that first bite, that bitter, bitter sour, because we thought they'd be divine and sweet. But I didn't know then that when you cook them and make a jelly and add the sugar and the lemon and that chemistry happens, that it turns into this amazing. It's very difficult to describe the beauty of the taste of a crab apple jelly. It's got this gorgeous, acidic, it's sweet sour. It's got a sweet sour balance that's really fantastic. The aroma of the crab apple jelly, that's the one. That, now you're getting me going, that is the aroma. Wow, very pungent, amazing, very spicy. And the colour, it turns into this jewel-like garnet, kind of nearly colour, so yeah, I do love it.
As a kid growing up, it would be the scent of the crabapple tree. And then for the vast majority of my friends, and then for people all the way down the country, this tree is one of the ancient trees associated with pre-Christian Ireland. It's a very, very important tree in the landscape. But the profusion of flowers, followed by that whole wave of bees coming down, that buzz, and you can hear it all around the flowers as they emerge in May. That in turn then is associated with the landscape right across Ireland. I think, to me, that is one of the scents, one of the flowers that produces scent that people throughout Ireland will actually remember for eternity. Honeysuckle grows wild in the ditches here. It's the scent of summer for me, where it makes my nose just tingle with the scent as you walk by. It's one of these scents and flowers, the structure of it, the stamens, the way it just unfolds. It just makes me stop in my tracks, and I have to go into the ditch, look for it, because it's not always obvious. You can smell it first, and then once you get into the ditch, and if you don't cut yourself with brambles in the way in, you can just bring your nose right up to this, and it's just the most heaven scent. One of my favorite moth species descends on it. One is the elephant hawk moth. It's quite strong in the day, but at night then it really becomes this kind of air-filled scent. And it's almost as if it's everywhere, but you just have to find the bush, and once you do, then it's there. So I think the fact that it actually is beautiful as a flower, it gives off this incredible scent, and then it also provides sustenance for different species of insect and things. I think that's just a wonderful combination. The smell of seaweed, for instance, or the smell of the ocean spray, salt in the air, that really kind of binds you, I think, in your head to a place like this, because even though life was tough here, when people go away, they often think, and I've often had conversations with people from islands, around the place here, or even from the local coastline, that what they miss most about the area is the sense of place, belonging, and the smells that they miss. And some of those smells are the smells of ocean spray or seaweed, because seaweed, the association with seaweed here is that they would have harvested, brought as it came in onto shore, they would have brought it up to their fields and spread it over their fields to really to condition the soil and to introduce nutrients and minerals and things like that into that mix. So it was really, really important association with the ocean here, both through a sense of the smell of the ocean, but then also then what it actually brought in for them. So these are just some of our varieties of kelp. These are kelp forests just offshore here. They're mostly around the rocks in a depth of about maybe 5 meters down. And when we get the big Atlantic rollers in during big storms, these just break off, particularly this time of the year. Every single rock has a name in Irish, but that's kind of been lost in translation. There's a rock up there called Corrigan Roan, which is the rock of the seal. And there's another rock there that has a kind of it's almost like hair on top of it. It's greeny, and then it's kind of goes white, the white grass. So it's Corrigan Vanaka, which is the grass of the white topper thereabouts.
I suppose aspirationally, I'd hoped to see something like the scent of the sea. My house is overlooking Kenmare Bay, where I grew up, and you could open the window on a rough day. You could hear the waves from the house, and sometimes you can hear the waves from the other side of the peninsula from our house, and we know the weather's really bad then. But that kind of saltiness in the air is definitely something that you kind of you're nearly home. I studied marine biology, and I worked in marine awareness and education for a while, and I did find it to be really meaningful work, but something that really struck me was how disconnected a lot of our community had become from the sea, even though we are an island nation. And so potentially that scent of seaweed, the scent of the beach, the scent of the ocean, it would be great to see that as the smell that identifies us going forward.